Okay, hi, my name is William Walters, Political Sociology, Carlton. It's a great pleasure to introduce Jussi Laine, who is Assistant Professor. Well, it says here Assistant Professor, but when I see how much he's published, I'm sure if he's not already promoted, he will be very soon. This month, there you go. Excellent. Congratulations. He's at the Karelian Institute, University of Eastern Finland. He's Vice President of the Association for Borderland Studies and affiliated with the Journal of Borderlands Studies. He's published many books and articles, books including the co-edited Post-Cold War Borders, Reframing Political Space in the EU's Eastern Europe with Routledge, and the co-authored Borderscaping Imaginations and Practices of Border Making, and many articles with top journals like Progress in Geography and Geopolitics. Today he's going to speak to the theme of exploring links between borders and ethics towards unbounded inclusiveness. There's unintended inclusiveness and unintended exclusion, as we all know. We'll speak for about 30 minutes and then we'll take questions. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much.
Still morning.
In Finland, it's afternoon. Good morning, everyone. This is going well. Very professional. Thanks, Victor, for having me here. It's always a pleasure to come to Canada, especially here in Ottawa. Thanks to everybody else in Carlton who's been organizing this event. And very happy to see so many familiar and unfamiliar new faces as well. Victor approached me to come to this meeting to come up with something new as a new approach or new direction for border studies, and my talk is towards that end. This is not a fully fledged empirical study that I've done, but I'm trying to point towards some of the aspects that I think should be given more attention in the field of border studies. So here's the talk, focusing on ethics and borders. And by exploring, I wanted to use the word exploring because I'm not here trying to provide the final word on the matter. The issues are very complex, but I'm trying to shuffle these two concepts a little bit. And you can see that the field of border studies has been going towards this direction already now. The very ethical character of border studies have become increasingly prevalent in the field of border studies. And while the field has been engaged with the questions of justifiable state borders and the ethical concerns related to their mere existence already for long, the aim here in this talk is to broaden the discussion by bringing in the more holistic and hopefully more balanced perspective on various, often competing points of view. Not just the borders per se, but the actual processes maintaining the borders. So the center of the evaluation here is not just paying attention to the ethics for the mere importance of the borders per se, but for the role borders play in evaluation of major social, global, political, economic changes and economic and social order. So let's start from the fact that we already learned from Randy this morning, is that the borders remain vitally important features of our political world. They haven't disappeared anywhere. That's the basic premise here. They continue to divide the surface of the Earth into blocks which are easier to manage and mark an area of governance and sovereignty. This is what we know, right? They also amplify the very innate human desire to demarcate physical space and protect not just one's own property, but also the sense of freedom. A sense of freedom to be different from somebody else as well. The territorial borders remain amongst the most fundamental features of the political world, occupying a strong, often unquestioned ontological position in understanding of international relations. And the present discussion very much assumes, however, the premise that crediting the prevalence of borders to mere sovereignty motives is both inadequate and misleading. And rather, my argument here is that it is the symbolic power of borders that continues to be immense and may have more to do, and this symbolic power of borders may have a lot more to do with the questions of belonging, questions of identity, than the actual sovereignty and self-determination. This has been illustrated quite well in the recent, often deeply emotional, if not ideological, debate on immigration, which has had little to do with borders of migrants themselves, I would argue, but has rather epitomized the apprehensions about disparities of wealth, peace, political freedom, and such factors all around the world. Not everyone is free to work, live, move, or even visit wherever they please. Immigration is literally the poor man knocking on rich man's door, Finland maintains, and the enforcement of borders is slamming that door shut. Most people do not question that countries should have clear borders and the right to control them. In this sense, national borders have been assigned with a high moral value. However, they undeniably carry also moral weight in determining the ethical responsibilities towards migrants, especially towards displaced persons, a number of which has been growing rapidly during the last years. Borders do not only divide physical space, but they are used increasingly to sort out people according to the degree of their belonging to a certain ethnic, cultural, political, and social groups. Our mobility tends to be increasingly based on from where we are from and where we are expected or perceived to belong to. The borders are not same for all, right? The question that I find very interesting when thinking about the ethics of borders is that who gets to decide the criteria based on which somebody is considered to be welcome and somebody unwelcome, or desired or undesirable migrant, right? The question is really, and my background is very much in what's going on in Europe, where the argument, at least my argument, is that we haven't really had that kind of increase in migration that the debate tends to let you believe. The numbers haven't been that striking. If we look at the numbers, we can see that even in the year 2015, which was the tipping point of so-called refugee crisis, more people left the European Union than came in. We just don't talk about that. So can we say that the response capacity or the resilience of the European Union was challenged by this high number of new arrivals? Was really the number the problem? Or could the problem have been that the people were simply wrong kind of people? And I think we need to have this kind of discussion openly. This is usually a topic that we shy away from, especially politicians. So who gets to decide the criteria based on which sorting is made? This is a question that we need to address, because this is also where the ethical questions are the more blatant, right? Ethics of borders, of course, have been already very extensively theorized for a number of years, but there hasn't really been a clear consensus on the matter. Very similar to what I was talking about, the theories in border studies. There's room for many different points of view. But what has been very telling is that in the more public debate on migration recently, the rational assessments and analysis of the benefits of migration have been very much overshadowed by these more deeply emotional and passionate standpoints on migrants. Again, referring back to Europe, but many countries, especially the one that I come from, Finland, we are losing population all the time, and the population is getting older and older and older. We could definitely use some migrants coming in. In fact, we are spending a lot of money trying to get people to move to Finland, the right kind of people. At the same time, we are spending increasingly more money to get rid of and blocking our borders from those people that we don't like. So again, very clear way of trying to decide who we want and who we do not want. So in this discussion, these different stands are commonly pitted against one another in rather simplistic manner, such as whether borders should be open or closed, or whether we should have borders or not. And I think this kind of debate hasn't really been helpful in actually grasping what is going on. And I restate my original argument is that the borders can be open and closed at the same time. And it really much depends who we are. The law of the birth still continues to define quite a bit of our rights to the freedom and many other opportunities. I'll get back to this very soon and trying to show you some examples. So what I try to underline here is that the questions about the ethics of borders is not the same as the questions about the ethics of border policies, border regimes, or the more informal bordering processes. These are all very different things, right? We need to be clear about our argumentation about the link between the persisting importance of territorial borders and the calls for increased border enforcement and cutting off asylum. These do not instinctively imply one another, but the underlying reasoning behind the mere existence of borders is quite different from the reasoning used to support either their openness or closeness. Right. In short, the ethical inquiry into whether or not the world should be divided by territorial borders in the first place is grounded in very different ontological premise than the moral reasoning behind the arguments for or against open borders. That is, the ethics of border control and enforcement. So, the question thus is how to balance the calls for freedom of movement against the freedom of association, and how much relative weight should one assign to each? That is, whose rights or wrong matter the most? To what extent can one prioritize one's own benefits and responsibilities towards one's co-citizens before those of others, especially the displaced persons? Let me see where I am here. So it is this conundrum that I wish to unravel by addressing the arguments used to support which might be or appear as inherently opposite stands. And it's such an inquiry into ethics, I believe, is now perhaps more topical than ever, as due to the various crises, the number of forcibly displaced people has reached the highest level since World War II. I think now reaching more than 70 million. Yet at the same time, it seems that the state's commitment to asylum has become increasingly conditional. Instead of solidarity, a number of governments in Europe, but also more worldwide, have opted for a more end-of-the-pipe solution by closing their borders, building walls, fences, you know the drill, in an attempt to restrict the incoming or transiting movement of people, some succumbing in the very knee-jerk reaction into building walls and fences, undermining in so doing the moral, legal, philosophical, as well as economic accounts of limiting the movement of human rights at borders. So as I already hinted, I find it very, very interesting how still in this very global world, the very arbitrary fact where one happens to be born continues to play a very, very important, decisive role in defining that person's abilities to enjoy not just mobility, but freedoms and enjoy life, basically. Where people happen to be born is a morally arbitrary fact, a matter of chance, as far as I'm concerned. And it's a rather interesting that is still the fact that will dictate where one can go, what kind of opportunities a person can have in life. I'll give you a personal example. This is just not my study, but taken from online, which shows you how mobility is based on your passport still today, the most beneficial passports. And the one that I happen to have, which is Finland, happens to be one of the most beneficial ones. And I was born in the eastern part of Finland, actually very close to the border of Russia, or Soviet Union at the time. And should I have been born a couple of kilometers to the east, I would have a very different passport at the moment. And I most likely wouldn't be talking to you at this, at this event, because traveling here would have been very, very complicated, and I have to go through various visa processes and so on and so on and so on. To come here, I actually took my bike to the airport in Helsinki and flew here. End of story. Done and done. And I didn't really have to even think about that. Whereas for many other people, that would have been a rather complicated journey. The same happens at the Mediterranean in Europe, the deadliest border in the whole world. I'll show you examples of that later today. A lot of people die, are found drowned in the shores of Mediterranean. And these are the same shores where we, from Northern Europe, ship people in planes on daily basis to have their cocktails and sunbathe and have all kind of lovely times. So the understanding of what kind of a border the Mediterranean is very different based on who you are. Right? Just the other end of the spectrum here, the most useless passports, if you wish, in the sense of mobility. Just making a point here, not analyzing the other benefits of citizenship. So, back to the argument about numbers and appearance. Now I took a couple of cases here. Mr. Trump's arguments, which I find that underlines the point really, really well. You probably understand what I mean. The problem really is not that, why people move around so much, and, why do we have all these high-skilled people coming here and benefiting our society, but why do we have these wrong type of people? And having the power to really determine what these countries are, or the people that we don't want, it's a major power to have in ordering society. I mean, this is just not a question of migration or border enforcement, but this is how societies are being ordered and structured, right? And another example of course, which is very much a tabloid magazine in the UK, The Sun, which also has so many bordering examples in one cover that is a fantastic use to use with your students, because this is a very clear example how the other is depicted as something against, threatening us, right? These very exaggerated, essentialized imaginaries as a threat, as something looming behind the borders, just waiting to get in. And when we talk about migration this way as a threat, it also affects how the border is seen, right? Especially in Europe, I don't really know how the debate has been evolving in here, but in Europe, migration is really discussed as something that is threatening the very European values that we have. And the borders are these barriers that are fragile, just needing for us to keep investing more and more money into them to keep us safe from something. I don't know what that something is, but my logic is that the more and more money is invested in border management, the more scared I am, because that lets me to be like, oh no, there must be something very threatening on the other side, because we need to invest 14 billion euros to build these fences. And this wasn't the case before. I think the situation between the US and Mexico is somewhat similar to this. But you can see how the logic works. And of course, this is biased illustration. But I like the tabloid media or the yellow press quite a bit, because it's very telling. And it's everywhere, right? You don't need to purchase these papers. You see the headlines when you wait for your train in the morning, or you do grocery shopping and so on. These pictures are everywhere. And the other here, they don't have names, they don't have ages. They are called killers, rapists, terrorists, very clearly telling you what the migrants are, right? And then us, we have names, Dave 53 and so on and so on. It's a very blatant illustrations of how us is defined in relation to them. Talking for too long, I assume. Another point why I think that the debate on migration has been biased or misleading is that most people do not move anywhere. Right? Most people live in the country where they were born. Globally, the number of international migrants is, I believe, less than 4%. Even in the European Union, the number of international migrants is 3.9%, which is, it's not a lot. It really is not a lot. Yes, the number of displaced persons have been growing, and this is what we should be focusing on. But even then, most of the refugees, 85% of the refugees and asylum seekers, they are hosted by the developing countries. They are not in Europe, they are not in North America, or in any of the so-called global north countries. But I'm not going to read the statistics here, but you get the point. So we are talking about a very small minority that is coming to Europe, that is coming to North America. And all of a sudden that seems to be a crisis, right? So, okay. So the borders are to distinct countries what fences are to neighbors, right? Means of demarcating that something on one side is different from what lies on the other side. A reflection of singularity of one entity in comparison with another. From this we can deduct that world without boundaries is a fantasy. Borders continue to play a fundamental role for many. We are a sovereign country, stated the US Senator of Florida, Marco Rubio, in a Fox interview in 2013, and continued by explaining that, and I quote, "Every sovereign country in the world has a right to protect its borders and who has access to that country. Every country does that. Why would we be expected not to do that?" End of quote. And this kind of statement very much reverberated the old Thomas Jefferson dictum that a country with no border is not a country. And it's very illustrative of the way how states' right to control their borders, that is entry and settlement of non-citizens into sovereign territories, is still often taken as a granted and widely considered as a legitimate aspect of the sovereign state's self-determination as dictated by the modern international law. Borders and the fights to keep them is as old as agricultural civilization. The era that we are living in, however, is characterized by the increasing complexity of the border concept, as we learned already this morning. Borders have very different meanings and impacts for different processes, practices, and people. Despite the heightened globalization and the array of transnational processes, the politics of the line endures. And I think that's William Walker's point. If anything, has become only more stringent. In the era of multiple ongoing crises, a strong nation-state is being offered as a medicine for chaos, and many are also ready to seize that. Much of the political and public debate has become rather partial, at times openly so, depicting borders in a black and white manner, either as good or bad, without actually acknowledging their multifacetedness and multi-scalarity. While it's difficult to support the increased segregation and discriminatory exploitations of borders, together with the official regimes, regulations, policies that maintain them, it is almost equally difficult to agree with Nussbaum's earlier somewhat naive claim that borders would be morally irrelevant. Surely, the Westphalian system, with its rigid understanding of borders, is utterly flawed. and often irrelevant in grasping the very logics of various border-transcending global processes of the contemporary era. It would, however, be quite a jump to derive from this that world without borders would somehow be a better solution and not come with defects of its own. Here, of course, we are not talking about only about the ethics of the territorial borders per se, but also the entire international system. Much of the academic examination in this respect has focused on the tensions between the deeply etched Westphalian notions of sovereignty and the universalist claims about humanity and human rights. While the former maintains that state system remains as the order-generating structure, allowing coexistence and diversity under conditions of anarchy and plurality, the latter puts forth the idea of an emerging world society based on cosmopolitan ethos and the recognition of common feelings of humanity. But as both the supporters of some form of cosmopolitan ethical schema mandating humanitarianism and those standing for the defense of sovereignty and the legitimate rights of the state claim to be promoting higher ethical goals such as order and justice, the apparent problem herein is how to choose the correct way to move forward. Would a world society be more just than the system of unjust borders? Whose moral compass should we rely upon in leading us to the way towards a better world for all? While the Westphalian model seems to be etched into our minds so deeply that coming up with a viable alternative may be a daunting task, the first step is to realize that borders do not simply exist as fixed material facts, but they are dynamic social constructions. This is to say that they are actively maintained by a multiplicity of bordering processes and practices, not only by the state. It is this realization that urges us to reorient our ethical compass in order to recognize that it is indeed us human beings that are at the side of moral agency, and not the impersonal sovereign states. Privileging the interest of those closest to you remains generally acceptable. It is, however, much more questionable to what extent the mechanism for deciding not only who is in and who is out, but consequently also who matters and who does not, needs to be made based on territorially bound citizenship. The idea that a particular state is habited by a particular nation, whereby citizenship gets formally connected to a territorially bordered space, has been a powerful one. However, it has become increasingly difficult to defend, not only because it's pure inaccuracy, but also due to its inherent logic of bordering of ethical responsibility. It seems quite understandable that an individual prioritizes the interests of those closest to him or her, say family members, relatives, close friends, and those he or she is over those he or she is less familiar with. This bond, membership, however, is clearly something more profound than what can be said about arbitrary categorization such as citizenship. Currents have argued that citizenship in Western democracies is the modern equivalent of feudal privilege, an inherited status that greatly enhances one's life's chances, and as such hard to justify with respect to a commitment to an equal moral worth of all human beings. What makes the territorial confines of ethical responsibility even more dubious is that nations, following Anderson, are socially constructed communities, imagined by the people who perceive themselves as part of that particular group. This is to say that in all likelihood, we do not know most of our fellow citizens, but we may have much more attached, we may be much more attached to citizens of other states and have closer bonds with them. At the other end, we have the cosmopolitan ideology that all human beings belong to the same community, based on shared morality. I can't see anything. Is that a zero? That is a zero. Okay. I still can't see it, so I'll continue. 2 minutes. Community, based on shared morality, positing people as citizens of the world rather than of particular nation state. While the universalist cosmopolitan ethic is based on the principle of shared common humanity and the idea of universal social bonds reflected is certainly an attractive one, it also comes with an array of challenges of its own. And given the time restrictions, I'm going to jump a little bit because I'm trying to make this more concrete, my ethical argument here. That's about the theory. And I'm going to choose to talk about, for the last minute and a half, about the external borders of the European Union, which is something that I've already mentioned. And I think it's very important to frame this also globally. And why I find this so interesting is that we are talking about the European Union, a body that claims to be representing the force for good in the world, right? Standing for the European values, none of which are negative ones, of course. Europe has hijacked all the nice words, right? That must be actually part of the problem. Why we are in the situation that we are in, because indeed much of these values are a lot more global than European ones. Okay, but as you can see, the borders of Europe in 2016, out of the 7,000 people who died globally in trying to cross borders, almost 5,000 of those died in Europe. And the numbers are striking. If you think about from 1990 to 2013, which is 23 years according to my math, 3,000 people died in trying to get to the European Union. And that is a lot, right? 2014, in 1 year, we had more than that. 2015, when the so-called refugee crisis, which was not a refugee crisis, I'm happy to answer questions on that, 3,700 people died. In 1 month, the month of April, 1,250 people died in trying to get into the European Union. 2016, more than 5,000 people. That is 14 persons a day on average. And okay, the numbers have been going down a little bit after that, but we are still talking about huge numbers. And I approach this from the more value-oriented perspective. And I said already in the beginning of my talk that the European Union has been investing more and more money in border enforcement. And at the same time, the number of deaths have gone up and up and up. And I would push this so far as to say that there has been a correlation between the money invested on border management and the number of migrant deaths, which really forces us to think about what is the motivation for this, and what are the actual values that we are standing for. We are saying that the migrants coming from outside, they are challenging the European values, but I would dare to say that we are eroding the very values that has been growing and developing in Europe during the centuries. And these are the questions that we should think about more carefully. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
That excellent talk. We'll now take questions in 15 minutes or so.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Jussi, for your excellent presentation. I do have the question about the crisis,
yes.
the refugee crisis.
Yes.
The number that you showed, for me, in human terms, show a crisis, probably not of numbers, but also let's consider that demographics have changed, right? We cannot compare the numbers because the population was growing at some point, right? The same thing, exactly what you're describing is what's happening on the Mexico-US border and the hemisphere of the Americas. So what is your argument? It's just, if it's because of numbers, then it's not so valid, but we have seen people dying and trying to make it. So in that regard, it's a crisis. Why you allege that that's not a crisis, a refugee crisis? People are around the world, because it's a worldwide phenomenon, are seeking refuge in other countries, in the rich world, right? That's a manifestation of our capitalist system. But I would like to.
It's definitely a crisis. It's not a refugee crisis. I think the wording is misleading because we are indicating that the refugees would have brought some kind of a crisis to us. A number of comments to this. It's not an isolated phenomena. Why much of these people are fleeing from the countries has to do with the policy decisions of the United States as well as the European powers to bomb a number of countries. That's why they are leaving, right? So we can't say that it's not our problem. The refugees haven't created the problem. It's a crisis of cultural encounter, especially in Europe. The people, again, not the number, but mainly appearance or values, religion, a matter that you shouldn't be talking about in Europe especially, feel that are challenging something that social glue that is perceived to hold the European societies together. So it's a crisis within Europe. It's a crisis of crisis management as well. It's a lack of political will. This situation could have easily been handled. Should have been a political will to do so, but there wasn't. The crisis was used towards various political advantages. You can see how the politics are going in a number of European countries. Some of them have been mentioned today in some interesting cartoons. What's going on in Hungary, what's going on in Austria, for example, Finland to an extent as well, where very ethnic argumentations of the people is being put forward, and this gets very highlighted in a very homogeneous countries such as Finland, for example, which has been very restrictive in terms of migration for a long time, saying that Finns look like this, they speak like this, and they believe in this, and then these new people are coming and challenging this. I mean, it's not really criticism towards the migrants as self, but they are. I think there's more ontological component. I think you had a very nice quote towards the end by Terence Garrett, I think, about borders as this kind of apparatus that creates the perception that we are safe, and I think that's exactly the case in here. And I think we need to think about notions of more ontological notions of security of the self. That how where am I and in context of the whole world? And is tomorrow going to be yet another day? Do I have a faith in my own lives and my relations, and how is this affecting to that? And I think people feel challenged. Their identity is being challenged by the migration. What it means to be European, and what are the values that should be ours. And I think in this sense, it is Europe has created the crisis and not the refugees. So there's definitely a crisis, but I think the word refugee crisis is misleading. That's the point.
Hi. So thank you very much. That was a really interesting talk, and I want to take you back to some of the earlier questions you posed and this sort of ethical framing. So it struck me that you started with this question about how we decide who is desirable and who is undesirable, and as you move through, you made this point that it's bound up deeply with notions of identity, not just sovereignty, and then you moved it to a discussion around citizenship, and so that often it maps, right? Citizenship means you're desirable, and not citizen means you're not desirable, and we use that as the mechanism to discriminate and to sort and to do all these things that happen at borders. And I just wanted to say I think there's a third category happening here, and in many respects, I'm sort of hesitant to raise this because I think the issues you've raised, particularly at the end of your talk, are fundamentally important and deserve our attention. But it strikes me we're also engaging in these sort of sorting processes internally as well as between citizens and non-citizens. And so I see the rise of trusted traveller programs as the reclaiming of privilege in borders by groups who found post 9/11 a loss of privilege, that suddenly travel became difficult for people who were relatively socioeconomically advantaged. And so I'm wondering how that fits into these notions you have about the ethics of it. Because it strikes me what's happening is states are allowing us to carve out categories of citizenship and the ethical complicity that we have in that. That when I get my Nexus card, right, what sort of ethical choices am I making in terms of the context you're talking about? And I wonder how much those are representative of we're moving to a place where actually you'll have gradations of citizenship. It won't just be about desirable and undesirable between state, individuals within the state and outside, but also within the state. So I think about this, you can't get an access card if you can't show consistent residence. You can't get an access card, presumably, if you have a criminal record. So we start to discriminate internally as well as externally. So I'm just wondering how that fits into your ethical framing.
Fits in well. I don't know what would be a sophisticated answer to that, but I do think there's a linkage. I mean, why I underline the role of citizenship so much is that it is, you know, when we consider who's deserving and who's not, or who's welcome or not, we tend to approach that from the perspective whether or not these people are useful for the society. And, you know, if they are not, we tend not to let them in. And, you know, if they are, you know, we need them high-skilled laborers and so on. And, you know, I understand that. But we also have people inside country with the same passport who might not be considered as useful in those very terms. But we don't kick them out. You know, so this is where the citizenship kicks in. I mean, we have a bunch of people who are not considered as useful for the society in the same way as we analyze migrants coming in. But nobody has opened that discussion, at least in Finland, that, you know, we have all these unemployed people who are not benefiting society, that, you know, we should take their passports away. That would be unheard of. But we are, at the same time, using exactly that argument towards migrants. So the citizenship carries, in that sense, a very, very strong role in certain countries, at least. Even though I have to say that I find that in the US it doesn't, because I have a Finnish passport but the US driver's license, and every time that I am stopped in the US and they ask me for my ID, I hand my passport and they're like, this is not a valid ID, where's your passport? And then I give my US passport and somehow I get off the hook, which I don't understand. But it's interesting.
I was wondering if you could comment on Estonia being a virtual country. With Estonians apparently have invited anybody on the planet to become a citizen. They don't even have to ever go to Estonia. All they have to do is pay taxes.
It's very telling. I don't know. I haven't studied that, but I'm very much aware of this. It has a limited set of privileges, though. I mean, it's compared to this golden passport that, you know, you can buy if you buy a property or invest enough money in one of the Caribbean islands. They give you a passport like that. But of course, this gets interesting in the case of Estonia, because then you also get the citizenship of the European Union and certain benefits based on that. So it has been used quite a bit for this kind of purposes. But I don't have much information on that, so I shouldn't make an argument. Yeah.
Thank you, Jussi. You did say that Finland is losing a lot of people and wanting more, but you made the added phrase of the right kind. Now, Europe is doing the same thing, but yet you are saying that Europe is misguided in treating refugees the way they are treating refugees. You also, in passing, mentioned religion as a reason for not having these people. I don't think it is without good reason. I mean, if you look, and let's be clear about this religion is Muslim faith. Mm-hmm. So let's be clear about this. If you look at majority Muslim countries and the way they have treated their ethnic minorities, it's not very pleasant. You look at Pakistan and the Hindus there. You look at Iran and the Baha'is. You look at Iraq and the Yazidis. You look at Turkey and the Armenians. You look at Darfur and the Christians. You look at Egypt and the Copts. So Europe will someday be subject to the same sort of threats if the Muslim communities become not a majority. They only need to become a sizable minority before problems are created. So I don't think the fear is unfounded. You really do have to look at it very carefully. Now, insofar as citizenship is concerned, there's a lot of misconception about what citizenship is. Not a right. A citizen is basically one who takes responsibility for everyone and everything in that country that becomes a citizen. Otherwise, if we take only the vow of allegiance to a sovereign, we are subjects, we are not citizens. Now, people who come from these distant countries, they don't really have a notion of what citizenship is. And unless you ask them at the border what they think, and unless you actually say to them, are you going to take responsibility for everyone and everything in this country? If they say yes, then you say they are welcome. But if they hesitate and say no, you should send them right back. What do you think?
This would take a while to answer, but I take your comments on religion very seriously, because of course they're not unfounded. You know, we can easily find arguments for them, and you know, we shouldn't, you know, shy away from saying that as well. But the problem is when we make these as official policy decisions, like the Visegrad countries have openly stated that they will not take Muslim refugees. So that becomes the determining factor above all the other criteria. And I think that becomes a rather questionable policy in that sense. Of course, I understand the fears for different religions and so on. I mean, let's face it, that's the very reason why Turkey is not part of the European Union. Because people are opposed to the fact that the second largest country in the European Union would be Muslim. That's why Turkey has not joined the European Union. I mean, you shouldn't say it in public, especially in a meeting that is being recorded, but there you go. So the fears have grounded. But I don't think it's a just policy to make an official policy that the whole religion is doomed because of that. And for those persons seeking asylum, which might have very legitimate right to seek for asylum, should be simply sidelined because they belong to, they are Muslim or believe in certain things. I think that's very problematic, very, very problematic. Please.
Well, you see, Islam and democracy are not compatible. A Muslim first allegiance is to Allah and to Muhammad.
But that is a major generalization, though.
It's not it's actually in the Islamic faith. I submit to Allah and Muhammad, who is the chief and final prophet. That is the definition of Islam. Now, you may say this is not so, Islam is a religion of peace, but the facts are very clear. My allegiance, I submit to Allah and to Muhammad as the chief and final prophet. You have to explore that openly. You can't just say, well, it's not so. It is so.
But basically that is then to say that assuming another religion, you get automatically approved. I mean, we have many of the recent terrorist attacks in Europe. They were not made by Muslims. They were made by Christians. They were not made by migrants. They were made by people who were already in Europe, many of them second or third generation Europeans with their French or German passports. So I don't think we can simply take one religion and put that on a blacklist without really thinking about the underlying causes why people are fleeing. Even if some of the arguments that you're making, I understand that. A lot of people in Europe are fearful towards Islam. There's no question about that. But I think from that, it will be quite a jump to go to the direction that you are leading.
I think we're drawing to an end of the session. We're sort of opening up a big can of worms just as it's time for lunch, and you know, worms lunch. We'll all be eating worms in a decade or so.
Now,
yeah.
so.
But anyway, I'd like to you all to thank Jussi for a fantastic talk, and thank you for your questions. And Victor might have something to say about lunch. Thank you.
Thank you.